Hello everyone, my name is Seth Villegas. I am a lecturer with the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. I'm really glad to be here today with Langdon White, who is a professor of Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. Langdon, in addition to being at the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences, also spent a lot of time at Red Hat and is the technical director for BU Spark, which is really a one-of-a-kind program here in experiential learning. So he has a lot of experience as a platform architect, and I guess from interacting personally with Langdon, I know has a great deal of software experience. So I hope that you have some questions about that, what it's like to work in industry, and I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. So I think for our very first question, this is called AI for Leaders. So how do you define artificial intelligence?
So this is, I was really impressed with these questions, as I told Seth earlier. But this one's an interesting one because I actually mentioned that I was doing this interview to my wife. My wife is not, in the technology industry, and her immediate response was actually basically looking at like LLMs as being kind of AI, right? Where my kind of running joke about machine learning is it's basically fancy stats with computers, and these LLMs that generative AI that we're calling it now, really are just predictive models where they're trying to guess, what the right next word is based on a lot of history. What's particularly amusing about this for me as well is that in the late 90s, one of my first jobs out of college, I was working at GE Research and Development, and one of the things we were working on was actually correction for voice recognition, and specifically in the domain of trying to do understanding like radiology, basically. And so what we were doing was we were taking a whole bunch of what we called n-grams and actually trying to predict what the next word would be in the context so that we could correct what was coming out of the voice recognition. And, I think even though the version I worked on was much, much simpler, that's kind of similar to what we do now with this generative AI stuff. When I was in college, however, I was very interested in artificial intelligence, and I really think of it as something that is artificially intelligent, right? And we may get there. This could very well be the path that we go down to get to true AI. But I'm not sure, what we're seeing right now is kind of still pretty rudimentary. It's really interesting. It's really cool. And I really like using it. However, it is not what I would classify as AI. It's really just, like a calculator, right? It's doing something that I could do given enough time, much, much faster, in some ways. I don't know if I would say better, but it's giving me, much faster results than I would do manually. So, but in my mind, right, that's not artificial intelligence. That's just kind of a generic speed up, right? I don't classify a calculator as artificial intelligence either, even though it can do calculations much faster and much sort of better, right, than I can do. So that's where I kind of struggle with this. When I think of artificial intelligence, I'm really thinking of, the movie Terminator, and that kind of thing. So, where really it is, much more comparable to a human, and you have things like the Turing test, right? And like these ideas that it is truly intelligent. And so, like I said, I don't know if we'll ever get there. We're probably going much faster down the path. One of the comments I often say about computer science is, remember, the entire field is like 100 years old. That's why we, still struggle with the names of things. Like a project manager, for example, is a pretty consistent term. But what a software engineer is and what they do is actually relatively inconsistent. So these are a bunch of different thoughts I have. I'm not sure that anybody has a great definition of what is artificial intelligence. I'm sure you could look it up in a dictionary and get something. But we're definitely on a path towards this kind of thing. But I'm not sure that what we're seeing right now is what I would truly consider something that's intelligent.
Okay. So I think that brings us to our next question then, which is how has AI actually changed? For example, I think if you were to take an AI course in the 90s or even in the 2010s, they probably wouldn't be talking about LLMs at all.
Right.
That's something that's been dreamed up relatively recently. Maybe they're doing neural networks, maybe they're doing all these other sorts of things. But I think, as you said before, people have just been trying lots of different methods to get at AI. So what have you seen personally over the course of your career?
Yeah, so this is particularly interesting for me as well, because when I went to college, like I said, I was kind of thinking about getting into AI. And at the time, people considered AI to be the combination of philosophy and computers. And so I went to undergrad for a philosophy degree. And then about my second semester, sophomore year, I took one computer science class, said, wow, this is so much easier than the philosophy classes I'm taking. And I switched majors. But my grand plan had been to go off and do a PhD in kind of a combination of philosophy and computer science. And, kind of over time, what happened was, what I found was, even when I was going into it in philosophy, that what people thought was the other half of AI, so it's always computer science and then the other half, right? Was kind of philosophy, and then it kind of moved towards like psychology with kind of the advent of neural networks and looking at those. And now we're starting to see it being actually mixed up a lot with linguistics, right? With generative AI in particular. So that, I think, is, from an academic perspective, really interesting how that has changed over time, because at least for me, I don't know of a lot of other fields where kind of the inputs into it from an academic perspective are quite different over time. And then again, I was talking about this with my wife, and she brought up things like war games, and I kind of just mentioned Terminators. Like, how has that changed over time? And I think we don't see a lot of movies on pop culture and stuff like that talk about kind of AI in that way as much anymore. There's a movie a few years ago called Her, I want to say, which had a pretty strong, kind of AI presence. So it's been really interesting that I think it's because we don't really know how to get there, right? And so, for lack of a better term, we're kind of grasping at straws. Like, we're trying all these different things to try to figure out how do we get to something that looks like artificial intelligence. And then kind of on the other side of the house, right, we also occasionally think about the moral and ethical problems that might be involved. But a lot of times in industry, you see things moving faster than necessarily the kind of morals and ethics can keep up. And this can be a huge challenge, right? Like this, we see this problem in social media a lot. Everybody talks about the algorithms, and maybe there's some moral and ethical components there. And I think AI is the same way. I think, we're already seeing a backlash against generative AI and whether there are some moral and ethical issues there. So I think that AI has changed considerably, sort of, in that how we're approaching it and how we're trying to solve it has been kind of evolving over time as we try to get, we're trying to take different shots at it from different directions, and some of them are more successful than others, but I think that's how we're seeing it mostly change. Now, on the flip side of that, some of that has not changed that much. Again, kind of throwback from my own career. In 1996, 95, I was working on neural networks, right? So neural networks have been around for a long time now, except that, they've kind of gotten more advanced and, and we have more techniques with them, et cetera. But they've been around actually for quite a long time. And now they're, kind of standard, right, for a lot of this kind of work. So that's how some of the ways that it's changed for me over the years. I'm still very excited by it. I still find it really, really interesting. But I think there is definitely some ethical concerns that we gloss over a lot. So that's my big concern too.
Yeah, I think hearing you talk, we're talking a little bit about semantic AI, which is kind of a dead-end term now, which is very interesting. And so people actually didn't have a lot of optimism about AI for a while, I think, because of that. And then there's a shift towards robotics, right? If we're talking about things like the Terminator and other sorts of stuff. And so we went from kind of like a disembodied AI to maybe robotics is the way to go. We actually need them to be able to move around in a space. Yeah. You could think of Boston Dynamics, which is also a local company that does that sort of thing. But then once we get to generative AI, we have a real optimism again,
Right.
and a resurgence of, you can actually just talk to ChatGPT and interact with it directly. It's not something that you're seeing on a TV. And I think that leads me into my next question, which is, in our sort of personal conversations, I know that you think that people should actually familiarize themselves as much as possible with these AI tools, that they're the future potentially. So what tools do you think that people should actually be using, and why do you think that they should be doing that?
Right. So I definitely wouldn't name a product, right? Because I don't think it actually matters that much to the point of the conversation. All of them are great in different ways, whatever. But the point being is that, I kind of mentioned calculators earlier. In the same way that you use a calculator in your day-to-day work life, right? You would never do a calculation by hand for the most part. I mean, a spreadsheet is 8 billion times better, but you don't build, very few people do accounting on paper anymore, right? And so I think these tools are similar, that they are going to become part of our lives in a really intrinsic way. And it's actually, I think, interesting how slow some of them are kind of actually entering our real lives in a sense. I'm really surprised that, kind of these, home tools that you can yell at from across the room, one made by Amazon, one by Google, there's an open source one that is really cool. I'm actually surprised they haven't really been adopting these tools a lot faster. But as far as I'm concerned, I think my kids should be using these AI tools as much as possible, wherever it's kind of ethically and morally correct. Their schools have various rules against them. Our school has various rules against them. And there is definitely this difficulty of, AI tools are really, really useful when you have experience, because you can tell by looking at the output, this is garbage, right? Or this is wrong, or this is how I need to modify it to make it better. But when you don't have experience, that's much more difficult. It's much easier to take stuff at face value. And if you're using AI tools for the kind of the intro stuff, which is where they actually excel, right? Where do you get that experience from? So I think this is the struggle, particularly in software development, which is kind of my background. Technically I'm in data science now, but that's because data science has only existed for 5 or 6 years, and I've been doing this a lot longer than that. But I've run into a lot of what I would have called data science over the last 20-something years. But so, yeah, I strongly encourage people to get the hang of these tools, because they are going to be as ubiquitous as a calculator or a spreadsheet. And you need to learn how to, kind of work with them and get good results. The downside is I think we're all struggling with, particularly in the software industry, how do we give somebody experience so that they can recognize when these tools are wrong? I think that a big part of it is actually using these tools a ton will give you a sense of, how they make mistakes, right? And then the other part of it, which I think is difficult, even for a technologist, right? I'm in technology. I have no other hobbies. I'm just, technology is my bag, right? When I use these tools, I still struggle to put my brain on sometimes and think about what it's going to do wrong. And one of my great examples of this is I was using ChatGPT at the time, and I was treating one chat and just kind of continuously talking to it, right? Without putting my kind of technologist brain on and realizing that I was going to run out of tokens. And as a result, over time, my answers were actually going to get worse, right? I wasn't giving it more context. I wasn't building up a brain or something, because at the end of the day, they're not intelligent. And so instead, I was building up, and just making it full. And so it wasn't figuring it out. And then another example was I was trying to do actually an example for a class, and I was showing, this, 10,000 record data set, and I was trying to feed that whole thing to I don't think I was using ChatGPT. I think it was Claude at the time, and I was trying to feed that whole thing to it, and just blowing out its tokens every time without actually kind of really thinking it through. So I think that's one of the things that using these tools makes you start to realize is you start to think about it. I think there is some value to kind of looking at the tips and tricks out there, because I think you've got to break your brain a little bit to realize that, again and again, right, whenever you're using one of these, you got to remember they're stupid. They don't actually have any intelligence. They're just using, essentially math to figure out what to do next. So you got to be really careful with them. But I think consumption, like using them, really does make a big difference to how that works. And to kind of the end of the question here, right? Like, I don't know that it really matters which one you use. I use ChatGPT a lot. I use Claude a lot. I've been playing around with Perplexity AI as well. I mean, there's a lot of them out there, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. So I think one of the biggest things you should be aware of, especially if you're working in the industry and need to deal with these tools, is kind of keeping track of the trends and what what's the company that is delivering that product focusing on. Excuse me. What are they trying to deliver? Because if that organization is trying to build, development tools, then that particular LLM is not going to do a great job at, writing prose or something. So you want to be sure that it's very similar to programming languages. When you're choosing programming languages for, a space, you need to understand the philosophy of that language to understand whether or not it's going to be a good choice for the thing you're trying to build. Python's classic for its, everything's included in the box. Well, if you want something that's lightweight and fast and is going to be part of a, serverless function, may not be the best choice, and something like Rust might be a better choice because the philosophy of the language is fundamentally different. So when you're trying to build something that it doesn't map to the philosophy of the thing you're trying to build it in, you're going to have a bad day, right? And so I think that's very true with these LLMs as well, is that you want to be, it's kind of fit for purpose, right? You want to be picking a product or having a range of products that you use in different scenarios depending on the kind of goal you're trying to accomplish. So that was a lot for that question.
Yeah, certainly. I poll my students, I think, pretty regularly on what they're using, on if they find it helpful. Some companies, like people do internships, and they actually encourage them to use AI tools as a part of their work now. But I will say across the board, I don't see a ton of hands usually going up when it comes to experimentation with this sort of stuff. I think there's a little bit of hesitation. So I think the people who've used things are very positive about it, but for whatever reason, not everyone is necessarily on board with that. And I think that brings me to my next question about how you think that
Actually, can I respond to that first part just a little bit? This is one of those things where, yes, I was kind of the same way, but similar. So I switched to Linux as my daily driver on my laptop, I don't know, 20 years ago, something like that. And the reason I did is because all the stuff I was building, and I was mostly on Windows, but a little bit of Mac too. But all the stuff I was building was ending up on Linux servers, right? So I switched to using Linux as my daily driver to force my fingers into using that tool and getting that muscle memory and learning how the thing worked, so that it was part of my daily life. And that's the only way I can do it. I can't speak to everybody else, but this is how I do it, right? And what I did with the LLMs is I was kind of the same way. I was like, what's the advantage here? And so what I actually did was I went out and I found some browser plugins that actually kind of integrated directly into your browser. So it was just kind of right there all the time. And I tried a couple of Linux clients as well. They were meh, but the browser plugin really forced me to have, because basically it had a sidebar, and so it forced me to see it all the time, right? And I was presented with it all the time, and I started using it. And as I started to use it, now it's become basically a daily part of my life. And this is kind of to my earlier question, or the earlier question is that's what I strongly recommend, is find a way to make it part of your daily life so you really integrate it into your life. And you may get mixed results, right? I mean, you might get really bad results sometimes, but that's okay. The idea is basically just to really learn it. but you have to put it in front of yourself, at least in my experience, to get yourself to use it all the time. Sorry.
Oh, not at all. I guess the reason why I want to talk about industry is because I do think that one of the reasons to use AI tools now, right, even if they're not required, is that there might come a time in which it's actually an expectation to use those tools at work, right, in which whatever your workload is like, it's not how much programming can you do unassisted in 8 hours,
Right.
It's how much can you accomplish with the use of these tools. It could mean an expansion of responsibilities. It could be a greater expectation of work. It could be more complex work. It could also mean, ironically, fewer jobs potentially, right? A company could feel like they don't need as many people because you have the augmentation of the employees that you do have. So I guess for you, do you kind of see things like that coming in industry for people who are working in software, working in data science, where AI is kind of a growing expectation for how people are going to work?
There's a whole mess of answers in that question, right? So the first one is, I actually just heard this from a student the other day, this past week, where there's also a number of companies that have privacy concerns that don't want you to use these AI tools, and some of them are really big. And so what's the negative impact to those companies going to be until they find a way to, basically certify or guarantee the privacy of the material you're providing?
I think some Sony people got in trouble for putting
Possibly,
some programming.
I don't know if I heard that story. But yeah.
Apologize if that's the wrong company, but there was something like that where people were using ChatGPT specifically to program and had very sensitive code that they're trying to get fixed. It now belongs to OpenAI.
Yeah, exactly. So you have that problem. I mean, imagine all the problems with medicine, just straight up HIPAA compliance. All of a sudden now we've got huge problems there. So I think that is some very real concerns that, but that one I don't think is actually going to be around for very long. All these companies, OpenAI, whoever, right? They're going to figure that out and fix it, in good ways very quickly. They'll probably fix it in bad ways first and then fix it in good ways. But the point being is that they will get the hang of it, and that should be pretty well solved. I think the other problem, the one I kind of mentioned before, which is so is how do we give people experience on the junior things when we have a tool that can do the junior things? I think you'll have some humans who just naturally are kind of at a higher level, and I don't mean necessarily experience, but one of the things that I found over the years, right, is that people who think like software engineers and people who think like software architects are not always the same people, and it is not necessarily a logical progression to be promoted from a software engineer to a software architect. Some people I've worked with, excuse me, they just drop in as software architect. That's just how they think. They think in how things are connected together more than they think about things that are pieces of it. And so I've always had a bit of a problem with how we grow people in the industry. One of the other classic examples is, but this has started to get addressed, is the promotion of a software engineer to a manager is not necessarily a good promotion, right? It's a very different skill set. I used to joke about when I was a VP at an organization, it's like nothing I learned in college is relevant to anything I do day to day, And I actually talked to my mother who was a provost at the time, of they should introduce essentially a reading of contracts, like contract law, into just their straight English program. So that required writing and English classes you had to take in college, one section of that should be about contracts, because everyone will end up reading contracts sooner or later. But long story short, I think we're going to have this problem that we really need to figure out of how do we turn junior people into people who can, who have enough experience with fixing what the output of a LLM is, and that's going to be a really hard problem. So that's kind of that piece of it. I think another piece that kind of you were asking, like I said, there were a lot of answers in there. Are jobs going to go away? I think if they do, and you're seeing some of that because now you're so much more productive with one of these LLMs as a software engineer or whatever, it won't last. It'll be a pendulum, or maybe not even a pendulum, but basically the work will fill the space that is required, right? We have, and the current downturn, I think, is really anomalous, and a lot of people blame it on basically overhiring during the pandemic and all that stuff. But we have, for my entire career, not had enough software engineers to the amount of work that we want to get done, right? I don't think that's changing anytime soon. So I think that, yes, we might see a negative impact for a while everything's kind of shaking out and people are starting to use these tools. But I think it'll come back in force. Like, I think it's going to just, it'll just expand to meet the available humans we have to do the work. And so I think that's, it's a short-term problem. Excuse me again. I'm not sure how short-term, obviously, but I think, eventually the industry will definitely fill the space with work. There's just too many different technologies and everything else that we need to build. I still don't have a flying car, right? Et cetera. That, we know all this stuff is out there and we do not have enough engineers to build it. So the fact that we can, upscale some of our engineers or even all of our engineers, I don't think that is actually going to stop the kind of continuous growth of the software engineering world. And to be clear, I've started to say tech adjacent, because it's like, when I say software engineering, I really mean, like data science and machine learning and, even things like data analysts and the associated roles, right? Like project management and product management and, all these things, like the whole bucket will grow, in my opinion. Maybe there's going to be some pullback while we try to figure it out, but over time, it's going to keep going. Does that make sense?
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, I think that's the reason to be optimistic. I'll definitely tell some of our more junior students about that, because I think they'd be very interested. So I do think that one of the big questions that people might have then is still about jobs and hiring, especially in this time. For me personally, whenever I kind of survey companies, almost all of them have AI in their title or somewhere on their landing page. Mm-hmm. And if I go and look at what they do, I'm not convinced that they're actually doing anything remotely related to artificial intelligence. It's just, tech company X. Right. And so my kind of question then is, as people are trying to size up job opportunities, how should they actually be evaluating companies? For instance, there was an LLM job posting for people with at least 3 years of experience, right? And you probably wouldn't have that experience unless you worked on the very first LLMs that had come out, right? Which shows a kind of disconnect between the jobs that are being posted and the kind of skills you're expected to have with that. So do you have any advice for our students when they're actually trying to look at these companies?
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit before, but I remember a very similar experience with Java way back in the day. Sorry. Where me and a couple of colleagues, we saw a job posting for Java experience of X number of years. I don't even remember how much it was. And it was before Java had actually released, so it was impossible, except that one of my colleagues had actually worked at Sun on Green, which was the precursor to Java. So he actually could have legitimately qualified for this clearly poorly written job. This industry, it's the only one I've really ever worked in, so I can't speak to other industries really, but this industry likes its fads, right? 10 years ago, you saw the exact same thing, but with containers. And so we always have fads in the industry. There's Gartner, right, has even created a product, right, or an idea, the Gartner hype cycle of like how exactly it works, right? Because it's so common. And so we have all these things that just kind of crop up and they get really popular. I think it actually has a lot to do with the problem that we often have in this industry is that people who don't work in the industry or don't have a technical background, they really fundamentally don't understand what it is we do or why, right? And so when you're putting out, kind of job ads or you're putting out, even marketing material or whatever, there's this kind of don't know if incentive's the right word, but like this kind of problem where people who don't entirely understand what it is that we do are trying to make the thing, whatever it is, a job ad in your example, but it could be a marketing piece or whatever. They're trying to make it more appealing to the market. And that doesn't actually mean necessarily to the people who they actually want to attract. It means they want to make sure those buzzwords are in there so that it gets, legs, right?
Yeah, make sure you know that our app is AI powered in some way.
Right, exactly. And it's funny because my first job at Red Hat was actually directly related to this. Is that there was a push, I don't know, something like 15 years ago now, where we started finally recognize the problem that if you have a salesperson who's kind of taking the complaints from your customers, and then that salesperson is bringing that back to the development team, that there's a loss in translation. And I am not saying in any way that the salesperson is bad or not smart or any of that stuff. They're just not a technologist, right? They're not a developer. And so you've started to see this role, which was originally called a developer evangelist, but is now called a developer advocate, where a developer, somebody with a development background, is the one who's actually contacting customers or speaking at conferences or whatever, and kind of listening to the complaints or giving ideas about how to use the products better. But then they're bringing that feedback back to the engineering team in a way that is not as lossy. Nothing's perfect, but it is definitely better. My running joke about Red Hat is I started in that role, and then they got tired of me complaining and pulled me into engineering and said, okay, fine, you fix it, right? But, and so kind of all that said, how do you kind of surmount that problem? Well, I actually think it's a wider problem in that it's kind of alludes back to something I said earlier, which is that remember, this industry is very young, right? And so as a result, you should really be reading every job ad very carefully and making sure that just because there's a title there, that you understand what it is they're actually looking for, because they may not be what you think it is. My current favorite is data analyst. Data analyst means 87 million different things depending on what company it's for. So you want to be sure that what job ad you're reading, you actually know what they're looking for. And then the other thing, and again, I can't speak to a lot of other industries because I haven't worked in them, but you also need to back profile the company, right? Is like you want to look up who they are and what they're doing. If it's publicly traded, it's relatively easy. But I have read SEC filings by companies before I've considered working with them. But then if it's a private company, there's still things like Crunchbase and, other tools like that where you can try to get an understanding of what they are. A good tool like Glassdoor is also really interesting where you can kind of get more information about a company. So I just think you need to do due diligence on any job ad, but I actually don't think it's just related to this particular hype cycle. I think we're just not that good at it to begin with, and so you really need to be sure you understand what it is this company is looking for and what the company is trying to do. Because the other part is you want to make sure that your goals are kind of aligned with the company's goals. I left at least 2 different jobs because I had ethical issues with the leadership of the company. And if I had kind of known going in that was going to be a problem, I obviously wouldn't have joined the company in the first place. But you want to make sure that where you're going and where that company's going are at least somewhat aligned. This obviously gets less true when you're talking about Fortune 50 because it's going in 87 different directions, but it's still kind of true. I don't. And I have my own kind of ethical, moral compass, but there's that, but there's also from a technology perspective, if you think, for example, that these LLMs are a terrible idea and they're going to be bad for the world or whatever, then you need to be picking companies that agree with you. And so I just think you want to make sure that you really understand what a company is trying to accomplish, and then aligning, and making sure that your goals align with that company's goals. And the last thing I would say too is, at least in my experience, I would also much rather be part of, the revenue side of an organization rather than the cost side of an organization. And so that's the other thing I look at in job ads is is this job contributing to the revenue of the company, or is it contributing to the cost of the company? Because I almost always want to be on the revenue side.
All right, I think that's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.